Hello to everybody. Hello to this fourth science talk that we organized together between JEDI and Falling Walls. We are holding these talks to make topics much more aware, which are of great importance. My name is André Lezeau-Pietri. I'm running the Joint European Disruptive Initiative that we're building up as the European equivalent to DARPA. So we launch grand challenges on topics which are today too risky or too long-term for the private sector, but that can have a massive societal impact. And one of the topics that we are very interested in currently is the topic of carbon sequestration into soils. And to discuss about that, we have a very, very eminent and international set of speakers. So let me introduce them to all of you. We have, taking that in the alphabetical order, Dr. Eric Cessia, who is a research director at CESBio, which is the Centre d'études de la biosphère, so the biosphere research center. And I think you work a lot, Dr. Cessia, but you will tell us more on satellite data and modeling of how carbon is captured. We also have Professor Paustian, who joins us from Colorado. Thank you for being early with us. So you are working at Colorado State University, professor in the Departments of Soil and Crop Science, and a major focus on your work is on modeling and field measurement of soil carbon sequestration. And last but not least, Dr. Jean-François Soussanat, who works with INRAE. INRAE is France's National Laboratory for Agriculture and Environment, if I put it right. So you are the vice president of this organization. You were very involved. So we have a Nobel Prize actually with us because you were with IPCC.
Shared with many.
Absolutely. You were very involved in the IPCC endeavor, and you will tell us more about the focus of your work. So without further ado, we have approximately 40 minutes in front of us. Feel free to ask questions to the different chats, live on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Falling Walls site, and on Twitter. And I will try as much as possible to give the questions back to the speakers. So let's be scientific, let's be disruptive, and maybe first question. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe you, Dr. Soussanat, is why does this topic matter?
Yeah, it really matters because we are confronted with the need for negative emissions. We need to draw down the atmospheric CO2 very quickly because time is running and we don't have enough time to reach a limit to global warming that would be beyond 2 degrees Celsius or beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius without having substantial negative emissions. The only way we can get negative emissions at low cost and at scale within just a few years is with the biosphere, and especially with the terrestrial biosphere, with the forests and with the soils. So today we speak about soil carbon, which is actually a huge pool of carbon, about 2 or 3 times as much carbon in the soils as in the atmosphere, just in the organic carbon. So if we're able to increase that big pool of carbon quickly enough, then we can really stop the rise in atmospheric CO2, or at least slow it down substantially. So we've been launching an initiative which was launched at the time of the Paris COP 21, which was in 2015. And it is based on the idea that it would be possible to rise the soil carbon at a rate of 0.4% per year, which is actually achievable, at least in the agricultural soils, in the crop soils. And this would contribute substantially to slow down the rise in atmospheric CO2.
So this looks obviously very promising. I mean, do you share that point of view, or you want to add something, maybe, Professor Paustian?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think certainly everything that Jean-Francois said is really important, and I think the other aspect of it is that soil carbon has an advantage over lots of other technologies, including some of the other natural biosphere processes, in that we can store this carbon on land that we already have in production for food and fiber. So we don't, one of the issues with large scale afforestation is there's a limited land base that can be converted into new forest. And so there are some real trade-offs there. But if we can increase carbon on, you know, existing lands, and we don't have that limitation of having to do some kind of land use change. And moreover, I think the most important thing perhaps of all is that, you know, soils and the health and productivity and resilience to climate change of soils, a major factor is its organic matter content. So the amount of soil carbon that a soil has improves its structure, its nutrient retention, its its water relations. And so really you're getting two huge benefits. Not only are you contributing to CO2 drawdown, but you are improving the vitality and the health of the soils, and healthy soils, healthy food. So it's really, I think this kind of a classic, you know, win-win-win situation. That, I think that's one of the reasons there's so much interest in this topic.
Before we delve into the science part, could any of you, I mean, please, any of you start, tell us why this seems, I mean, this is probably an outsider view, and I may be completely wrong, why does not seem to get as much attention as you mentioned, reforestation? Is actually soil carbon capture, carbon sequestration already in the making? I mean, is it really already effectively used as a policy?
I don't know who wants to start, but just I'll say just a few words. For one thing, you can see the carbon in a tree. It's much more difficult to see the carbon increasing in a soil. And this has been really one of the strong limitations we have seen over time, is that we are not currently able to measure that buildup of soil carbon at scale and at low cost. I think we will go back to this.
Does somebody maybe want to add something on this? On the limitation?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's also, though, it's just a little outside of a lot of people's experience, you know. And I agree with Jean-Francois that you can see the carbon in the trees. You can see the trees, and what's below ground is, of course, you know, more unknown and more mysterious. I do think, and I know we're going to talk later, that we, you know, that we can measure now. We need to improve measurements, but we'll talk more about that later. I guess the other thing I would say, though, is there are technologies, and, you know, we know how to do better management of soils in terms of the management systems and the conservation practices. So it's not a mystery, and we have a lot of empirical evidence of how we can improve carbon stocks in soils with better management. So we've got a strong empirical base to start with, but it's just not been a topic that has been so much in the public mind until very recently.
Maybe Dr. Sequestration, you want to dwell at this point on the science part? I mean, what are today the biggest limitations for effective carbon sequestration?
Sorry. Well, the biggest limitation for carbon sequestration, it requires some changes in the habits, in the way that we manage lands, and which requires some teaching, some time but it's not always that easy to change their habits. The farmers have been using some approaches, some intensive management of the cropland that maybe are not ideal in terms of carbon sequestration, and we need to change that. We need to help them to adapt to new practices, which requires education, but which requires also some financing of those changes. Sometimes it requires changing or modifying some tools, and also we need some methods for monitoring the changes. And so far we've been a bit limited by that. We were not. It was difficult to quantify also the effect of those changes. It could be done at some small scales on the experimental plots, but to assess that over larger scales, it wasn't that easy. And if we want to make the things change, we have to prove at large scale that those changes in management practices that can increase soil carbon sequestration, well, they work over large areas in different climates and cropping systems. And we were missing such tools, I think, so far.
And could you tell us, when I looked at all three resumes when I was preparing the session, I mean, the word modeling comes up all the time. Could you, maybe starting with you, Eric, and then to the others, could you tell us where today we are in the effective way of being able to measure how much carbon is sequestrated? Is this done at the ground level, or are we now using space and satellite imagery increasingly? Could you tell us maybe also about hyperspectral, because this is also a growing area? Tell us a bit today where we stand and where are the frontiers.
Okay, so first, maybe I should recall that there were mainly two approaches for analyzing or assessing changes in soil carbon stocks, especially in agroecosystems. One, or the traditional way, was based on the measuring soil carbon based on soil analysis, on some soil sampling, which is a bit expensive, time consuming, and that gives that doesn't give a very dynamic vision of those changes. You need to wait a couple of years before you can actually measure some changes in soil carbon stocks, which makes it difficult sorry, I had a call, which makes it difficult to link it to some changes in practices. And then there are several modeling approaches that were based on those data sets. So there were typical modeling of soil changes in soil organic carbon content based on soil models. And then there are other approaches that are more based on the fluxes, the inputs and outputs of carbon of the ecosystem. And some methods were developed in the last decades that allow measuring in much more dynamic way the changes, the exchanges of CO2 between the plots in the atmospheres, which means that we can assess much more dynamically the changes in the carbon stocks at the ecosystem level. And some other methods, some other models have been developed more based on this kind of approach. And then more recently, even there are some approaches based on remote sensing that allows either to directly monitor the changes in soil carbon stocks, but that give us only information concerning the surface of the soil, if there is an increase or decrease in organic content, and then more indirect approach based on remote sensing that will try to focus on much more on the vegetation development and how it will impact soil carbon stocks, So there are a panel of solutions, of methods that can provide us some information. And maybe now the idea is to try to merge those methods so we have more accurate, efficient tool and more dynamic approaches to assess soil carbon stock changes. Maybe Jean-François or Keith have other ideas. Yeah.
You are muted, Keith.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. No, I agree with Eric. He made some really great points there. And I think that's what it's about. It's really about, we have to have cost-effective methods and tools to quantify soil carbon. And the reason why the quantification is so important is because there's a lot of interest now in potentially in investing in carbon projects and things like this. And there is higher uncertainty for carbon than there is for things like direct air capture, where you get the CO2 and then you can measure the amount of carbon that you have because it's in a pipe and you're pumping it underground. So there's very high certainty in terms of how much of the carbon you're storing if you're measuring, supercritical CO2 going through a pipe. And it's much more difficult, of course, in the ecosystem because, for one thing, soil carbon has a high spatial variability due to the, differences in topography and the patchiness of the landscape. So you can measure it with the traditional kind of taking samples and taking them into the lab, but because of that high spatial variability, you have to take a lot of samples, and that's quite expensive. And so what we're trying to do, I think, is what Eric suggested is really combine things. So use a few ground measurements done strategically, but then use modeling, use flux measurements, and some of the eddy covariance flux measurement instruments now are coming down in cost. And I think that the area that Eric is working in now with data assimilation from satellites, it really together with models has a huge potential because, if you think about what is it that's controlling the carbon that's being stored in the soil, it's a balance of the carbon that's coming in via the plants and carbon that's going out via the respiration of the soil biota. And measuring that respiration, you can do that with flux measurements, but you can infer a lot about the carbon that you're adding to soil by being able to, for example, monitor with remote sensing and model the amount of vegetation and how's the vegetation growing, because it's kind of where the carbon inputs are coming from. So I think that kind of approach that combines modeling, ground measurements, fluxes, remote sensing is really a way forward to be able to take quantification to scale and give then much more confidence to investors that the carbon sequestration is real, and therefore you can give incentives to farmers to practice improve conservation practices or adopt new technologies because because you can measure it accurately, and so now you can manage the problem. And I think that's really a key issue right now that we're I think we're on the cusp of making some major progress in that area.
Maybe pushing you on this part. I mean, what would be the tipping points? It's technological progress. It's doing it at scale. Is the policies that need to put a value once they can measure precisely the carbon capture.
Yeah, I think all of those, and then there's also the more maybe the more mundane part of we want to you need to incentivize farmers and ranchers and we need to have systems that are also more economic or better for that people will want to adopt them, and they need to to know how to do this. It's a different way in some ways of farming perhaps than some of the conventional practices. It's not necessarily radically different, but there's a whole education and extension component to to support those, to support the people on the ground, because we, at the end of the day, we're essentially going to depend on millions of land managers, of farmers around the world. We want them to adopt these improved practices that not only draw down carbon, but make economic sense, so that so the farmers are better off economically, and we have healthier soils and more resilient ecosystems. So that's really the grand challenge. And I think it is achievable. It's a lot of work, no doubt, but I think the scientific community, I think, is really quite energized to continue working on and help move this to a real solution.
Dr. Susanna, how would you see that all this, what Professor Postian just mentioned, can be accelerated?
Yeah, I fully agree with Keith. Obviously, the point is that it's really about greening agriculture. What you want to do is having no bare soil, so always having vegetation covers that will provide some carbon into your soil, and therefore build up your soil carbon. And to do this, it's true you need some advice for farmers. You need some economic incentives. So we know the costs in Europe. We know quite well the costs in France, and they are around 60 to 100 euros per hectare, approximately the same value per ton of CO2 that would be drawn down from the atmosphere. So that's substantial, and you need someone to pay for this. And that's where, for someone to pay for this, you need someone to measure it. And I think we can have really this vision that we get a system that combines remote sensing, modeling, and ground truthing that will be at low cost. So something like a few euros or US dollars per hectare. And that will be with an accuracy of about 30%. Compared to the value of carbon sequestration you may be able to find. And this value, it's around having, after 5 years, an increase in your soil organic carbon stock by between 1% and 2%, which is really small, but you can get there in terms of measurements with that combination of modeling, remote sensing, and ground truthing. And I think that we do have some proof, in fact, that we can do this with approximately that accuracy, not in terms of the baseline. It's an interesting finding. It is that it is more difficult to achieve accuracy on the baseline than to ensure accuracy on the difference between carbon storing practice and the baseline. This is because much of the uncertainty is similar in the baseline and in the modified agricultural treatment, where you get more plant cover and more carbon going back to your soil. So we think that we will get there with around that level of accuracy and relatively low cost. And if we can achieve this, this will be really groundbreaking. And we believe that it requires international cooperation. So we are launching, with support of European Commission, an international research consortium precisely on this, but also to help understanding what are the best practices in different regions of the world, and how you could also get the necessary funding to scale this out.
My turn to forget the muting part. If I understand you well, all the components seem to be in place. Today, if I can push you on that, Jean-François, is what is really needed to make it happen? Because, I mean, the pandemic told us that we need to think in days and weeks and not anymore in months and years, unfortunately, for all these major challenges ahead of us. So time and speed is of utmost importance. How can that be accelerated? Are there still any scientific issues to solve to combine these different sources? Or is it more a question of scaling and bringing down the cost? Are these instruments today, these modeling tools already available? I would love to hear you more also on the scientific part of things.
Yes. Maybe I can just say that, yes, there is some research needed and some, let's say, technological innovation in terms of combining all this. And I think I will also leave it to Keith and Eric to comment more on this. But I just like to say that it's pretty much a matter of a sort of push and pull. We have a scientific push. We can make innovation. We can show that it is feasible. But then we are always asked, okay, but how are you going to provide this to the farmers? But then you could have some web apps that would be on the mobile of a farmer, combining all those data sets, all those data streams, and it could be helpful. And then it's also a matter of who decides that the measurement system you're providing is correct or not. And you need a sort of legal statement on this. So, for instance, in France, we now have a Ministry for Environment that is providing a label that is called the low carbon label for voluntary initiatives for offset projects for carbon, for instance. And now you see that the farmers' unions and more, I would rather say the industries, they are working on methods that they derive from our scientific knowledge that will be checked by the ministry, and if accepted, would allow any industry to certify those carbon credits, and therefore to have a value placed on those carbon credits. So I think you need a sort of combination between research, industries, and governments to make it happen.
Eric or Keith, you would like to comment on this? Maybe also from a US perspective. I mean, the US is living in incredible times these days, so but it would be interesting to see your outlook on this.
Yeah, we're we're back in the Paris agreements for one thing, soon enough, hopefully, in another 70 days or so. But no, I think it's if we, I guess from a U.S. perspective, I think the other thing that is, and this is kind of in our current situation, there are actually, as all of you know, the climate debate is more polarized in the U.S. than probably most places. I think certainly over the past several years, the majority of people in the U.S. are understanding the climate challenge, and particularly the young people here are pushing very aggressively. And now we have, the new administration is going to, certainly try to do what they can. It's, we've got a divided government. It may not be that easy to be as aggressive as many of us had hoped would be on the policy front. But the one thing I would say is, within the U.S., at least, the probably the most bipartisan area between Republicans and Democrats with respect to climate change and climate change mitigation is actually around this area of soil carbons. So, it may be that that we're working on the technologies and scaling up efforts to get more carbon sequestration happening in the U.S. will be the most politically feasible, if you will, action that can be taken at this point in time to go forward on climate change mitigation. So I think that's I guess my read of the current U.S. situation. But we've got to keep moving forward, and hopefully the policy environment improves over time, and we can do the things that need to be done.
Well, definitely some encouraging signs. And on your side, Professor Secia, could you tell us maybe what is today the most promising, or those who needs to be most developed among the robust measurement things? Is it MRV? Is it spectroscopy, remote sensing? Which still needs to have the most effort to be developed in this area of sensors?
Well, I would say that most of the work is about coupling the approaches.
Without interrupting you, what do you mean
there
coupling?
Is
making the data coherent and consistent that you can really?
So, in fact, it's coupling in different ways. First, we have to well, let's say couple the data fluxes, the data flows, some data from remote sensing that can see the vegetation development or the changes in soil carbon stocks, some data coming from the farmers that provide us additional information on their management practices that we cannot see from remote sensing, for instance, and some data related to soil properties. There are some soil maps, they have to be improved. For this, I mean, if we could collect more freely information about soil properties based on soil analysis done by the farmers or by other different companies. So there is a first challenge that is to connect those fluxes of informations, of data. And then it's about connecting some modeling approaches, also some that are more focused on the vegetation development, others more focused on soil organic carbon changes. So that's the first challenge, is to connect data fluxes and some modeling approaches. And then there is, of course, some specific work to do on those different aspects, but maybe more on the remote sensing part. You know, for one example, at the moment we don't have any map of one of the main practice that would allow us to store more carbon in the soil, that is cover crop or intermediate crop or catch crop, call it as you want. Right now, for instance, in France, in Europe, or elsewhere in the world, we have no idea where, if a given farmer is growing cover crop, for how long, if it's producing a lot of biomass or not. So that's a first thing that we have to develop, is to some automatic method, because we can do it on small areas, we can map that, but at large scale, that's more difficult, and we have to develop some methodologies to be able to track the management practices that will allow to store, or that could cause a decrease in carbon stocks also, but to manage the management practices that have an impact on carbon stocks. And then it's about taking that into account in a systematic, automatic way in the models that can simulate the changes in the soil carbon stocks. So there is some work to do there. And maybe last point I would say is, I was mentioning that we need some good data also concerning soil properties, especially the soil organic content, the carbon organic content of the soil. And remote sensing can help us there also, but we have to develop some automatic approaches. So there is a bit of artificial intelligence to develop there, because that could increase the accuracy of the large-scale modeling that we would do in order to map at national or European or continental scale, but at high resolution. It means for each plot at those different scales, the changes in soil organic carbon. So well, maybe I would stop there.
No, thank you. This is super enlightening. Maybe coming back to Dr. Susanna, I mean, you mentioned about the efforts also on the European side, and both Keith and Eric mentioned the normalization aspect. How much are norms and standards for this measurement going across the world, or is still every block? We didn't talk about Asia at all, or South America, which are obviously big players too. Is this today the normative aspect of things? Is it solved, or is there a common language, or is there more needed on that part?
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. Well, there are some efforts which are led by the Global Soil Partnership that has a secretariat at FAO for standardizing soil measurements. So you have a number of protocols that are agreed now by countries to measure soil carbon. But as you have seen from the conversation, this is far from being enough. And for the protocols that would connect the remote sensing, the modeling, the soil data, climate data, and so on, we do. This is still pretty much in the research sphere. So exactly creating this type of standard is something that needs to happen so that it can be used by players which are in fact international, such as some of the corporates. We are precisely trying to create an international research consortium on soil carbon, also to be able to propose systems that could potentially cover the globe, that would create a standard. And this obviously cannot be an effort from a single country. It needs to connect teams working in many countries. And we are ready working to prepare this also with Keith in a framework of a project that is planning what could be the roadmap for such a consortium.
Keith, you would like to comment on that? Because when I hear speaking more and more about the role of data also, and probably of platforms, could we have also new players entering that game? Because agriculture is obviously a major economic sector, not only for food safety, but also economically playing.
Yeah. No, I guess the way I look at it is also that we're, it's kind of working along a continuum. Yes, we know that we've got technologies that are kind of in the laboratory that we feel pretty confident will be, refined and implementable, in the near future. I would argue that we have some technologies now that, they're certainly not perfect, but they're sufficient to guide, to move policy, to get projects on the ground. And I think there will be a continual improvement in those technologies, and other things that and Eric was alluding to things like I've got a colleague, for example, who's doing work developing decomposable soil moisture sensors that cost a few pennies a piece and can be sort of put out in the field and sort of put in, scattered, if you will, or put into a seed box on a tractor, and going across the field can be planting these decomposable moisture sensors in the ground. And so you would know, at very high resolution, changes in soil moisture that occur over the year, and you could use that information again in a data assimilation with models. Because then you're getting a very valuable source of information about the soil moisture, which controls, or has a big effect on not only plant growth, but also on things like microbial activity and therefore organic matter decomposition. So those kind of things, are we going to have those next year? No, probably not. Maybe in 2 or 3 or 5 years, yes. And then beyond that, there will be new things. So I think it'll be, it's a challenge that lends itself to continual improvement over time. But I don't think that means that we need to wait until we reach some, idealized quantification capability. We can start now, and as much as anything, I think you have to go into an implementation phase. You have to use the technology you have, try things out, get projects on the ground, have investment, make mistakes, learn from the mistakes, and make corrections. It's, I think if we wait, until we reach some idealized point in time where we say, oh yeah, the technology, we've got all the kinks worked out now, now we can start. And then I think we will have wasted a lot of opportunities, because no matter when you start, you have to learn lessons by doing it. So I think that we're at the point now, which again is very exciting, that I think the technology is there. It's imperfect, but there's also the interest among producers. There's the interest among companies and ag industry to move in this direction. So I think we need to be cognizant that we don't have perfect solutions, but we need to get busy and start doing it, learning from our mistakes, and keep after it, and our capabilities will improve over time. And then I wanted to add one last thing that we haven't really talked about now, and I think there's we've talked a lot about let's get farmers, let's incentivize them to implement technologies that we already know about, cover crops or reduce tillage and improve crop rotations and things like this. But there's also, I think, the possibility of new technologies that don't yet exist, that we've never had the plant breeders working so much on trying to manipulate root characteristics, and can we have new crop plant phenotypes that have deeper roots, more roots, roots that have chemistry that maybe retards their decomposition some. There are various people starting to work on this, but it's very early stage. We haven't really got plant breeders and that kind of technology engaged to, can we make plants that pump more carbon into soil but also maintain their yields, and can we do some of both? I think those kinds of technologies, people are looking at microbial inoculants, can they do something? We don't know, but I think there's a lot of efforts out there in terms of also new technologies that aren't current practices that we need to be doing research on and exploring.
Well, this is the perfect segue. It seems to be a topic that interests a lot of people, because at a certain point we were more than 160 in the audience. There are 20 plus questions. But please, Eric, you wanted to add something to that? Most of the questions are your point, Keith, about what can we do more and maybe the biggest obstacle. So maybe we can finish up on that. But please, Eric.
Yeah, very short. Just because my previous intervention was maybe sounded a bit pessimistic, or there is a lot still to do. No, things are going quite fast, and just to give you an example, we are now developing some tools for the new CAP in Europe, the new Common Agricultural Practice in Europe, that are based on remote sensing, and that will allow us to monitor some of the management practices that I was mentioning, like cover crop, at European scale for the next CAP. And we are developing now some methodologies. We will test them in next year, or maybe 2 years maximum, to estimate carbon budget at plot scale based on some combined approach that I was mentioning before. So things are going very fast, and which means that we should be able in the coming years to have at least some first approaches that are operational to estimate some carbon.
Thank you, Eric. I mean, we're unfortunately coming to an end, but maybe I'll try to recap most of the question into the following two, and maybe all of you could have a word on that. Number one is, where do you still see the biggest challenge? And secondly, where is your biggest hope? I mean, is today the policy side driving? Is it the science side? And the last question that comes up a lot in the question is, what can we learn from the current pandemic about the relationship between policy and science? Did we get it right, and how can we get it right on this matter? Maybe, Eric, it's a lot of difficult questions, but please try a shot.
Probably Jean-François has a broader vision than me on that, so maybe I'll leave him.
I wanted to leave Jean-François conclude on it, but please, please.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't know. I'm not sure that in this respect we've learned anything, from the pandemic, other than we're all much better on using Zoom or StreamYard or GoToMeeting or all the other different platforms. We're more comfortable doing that. I think ultimately the thing that I think is key is that we have a different, we need to have a different vision of agriculture, a different vision of our working lands that need to be, you know, they need to be healthier. They need to have, yes, they need to store more carbon, but they, you know, they need to be, you know, managed on ecological principles, if you will, and it's such a better vision of our you know, of what's possible. And you know, I think the carbon part may be a catalyst that can help move us in that direction towards really having healthy, diverse, you know, high functioning, low polluting, you know, ecosystems, agricultural, grasslands, and other things. That's, you know, that's where we need to get to. And it's a complex. It's going to need policy, but it's going to need, you know, the guys on the grassroots and people that choose to, you know, to buy products that come from, you know, regenerative ag practices and the whole thing. So it's really it's all a society that needs to, I think, you know, kind of move together in a lot of different ways to, you know, to achieve that vision. But it's a very powerful vision, because not only does it make a major, you know, positive impact on climate, but on, you know, just our environment and the planet, you know, whether it's water pollution and erosion and sedimentation, all the different things, you know, how we manage our lands makes a huge impact on our quality of life just in general.
Maybe before I leave, Jean-François, give it to you. I mean, there's one question that I need to pick up from the chat, which is to you, Keith. Is you talked about a certain continuity. How much is this vision and these measurement tools a first world, if I can take approach, or how much can that be also be applied in probably less well-off countries? Is there an opportunity for some of these countries to leapfrog directly to that, or is it a bit basically a rich country?
No, I think there is an opportunity to leapfrog, and we need to work with our colleagues in, you know, in developing countries in the global South. That and really, I would argue that that's where the biggest opportunities are, and that's where, in many ways, there's the biggest need. But I think there's a lot of capacity, a lot of interest and opportunities that are in, you know, that are not in the first world, that are in the global South, that are that are engaged with this. So I think absolutely there's opportunities to move very aggressively there, and that should be a major priority.
Yes, indeed, and I think I share that vision of really planetary health. So achieving increased soil carbon is a way to create, to contribute to planetary health through healthy soils and a healthy food. And this is, I think, something which is quite similar to this COVID-19 pandemics. There are some possibilities that this pandemic started from pressures on biodiversity that led to a spillover of a virus from wildlife to some animal species and ultimately to humans. And all this is also because we were not able to keep the good health of the ecosystems by protecting those ecosystems. So I think this all goes together into the concept of a planetary health that is actually one of the big options also to face climate change.
Oh, muted.
I was saying we had a lot of signs of hopes in the last days, and thank you for all these these very positive touches. I mean, it was very deep on the science. Thank you very much to all of you. We definitely, I think we need to engage much more with you on what we could do and how we could, as JEDI, contribute to these efforts to accelerate. We really believe in the power of grand challenges, because it's a way to get the famous interdisciplinarity, which is a bit a buzzword, but that's where also the breakthroughs come from, and where we can also accelerate change. So Dr. Susana, Professor Postian, Dr. Secia, it was really a pleasure. Thank you so much for your insights. There are tons of other questions. I'm going to direct some of them to you if you wish to answer, and that's clearly the start of a conversation. Again, thank you very much for all this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.